Great. Thank you very much for being here and joining us today for this webinar. And thank you very much to our speaker, Steve Frank, who is an extension specialist in the Department of Entomology with North Carolina State University. So thanks very much, Steve. Take it away.
Thanks, Stacy, and thanks for checking out this video. I'll talk about IPM for Ambrosia beetles in nurseries for the next little bit. And Ambrosia beetles are one of the most important pests of trees in nurseries, and they're also very hard to manage. And we'll get into some of the reasons why this is, and hopefully give you some tips on how to improve your management and reduce your economic damage from these pests. The Ambrosia beetles, the two most common that we have to deal with in nurseries are exotic species native to Asia, and this is the Granulate Ambrosia beetle, Xylosandrus crassiusculus, and Xylosandrus germanus. There's several other species that can attack trees. These are the most common. But in most cases, it doesn't really matter which species because they all do similar things. So the basic biology of these critters, the female beetles in North Carolina emerge very early in spring and even in winter. And they spend the winter in leaf litter and wood lots and things like that. And the beetles become active typically when we get a couple of 70-degree days in a row. And this can happen even in January oftentimes, but is more common in February and March. The small beetles bore into the sapwood of the trees. They inoculate the trees with an ambrosia fungus, and then they lay eggs inside of the galleries that they make. And so the galleries are deep in the heartwood of the tree. And then there's another generation 50 or 60 days later. The Granulate Ambrosia beetle and the other species are very generalist. And so they attack many, many species of trees. And the most common nursery trees are almost all potential hosts for this. So styrax, cherries, Japanese maples, dogwoods, and magnolias are very commonly attacked. So oftentimes the deciduous trees that we grow in nurseries are almost all susceptible. The damage that these beetles cause is small when you look at it, but it's often irreversible. And so, of course, they bore into the trunk, and anytime you bore holes in a tree, it's not a good thing. It provides an entry point for disease and weakens the trunk. They inoculate the trees with the fungus that I mentioned, which isn't a plant pathogen, but it does clog the vascular system of the tree. And growers frequently identify these as the most damaging nursery pest. Ambrosia beetle management typically entails monitoring beetle activity with traps in late winter, followed by permethrin applications to tree trunks. And these can be reapplied every 2 to 4 weeks after the beetles are trapped. And the damage primarily occurs in the spring from ambrosia beetles, even though they're active all year round. And we'll get into some of the reasons why the first generation of beetles are very damaging in nurseries, but subsequent generations are typically not that damaging. So this is the typical management scenario. And in my lab, we've worked on several ways to try and improve ambrosia beetle management that we'll talk about now. And so typically, again, there's monitoring with traps to determine when the beetles are active, and permethrin applications often applied with one of these airblast sprayers. And you can see these sprayers go up and down the rows blasting into the growing beds with a fine mist of insecticide. The problem that we saw with this scenario is that the ambrosia beetles typically only attack the bottom couple of feet of the tree trunks. And so below the first lateral branches typically, and usually within 3 or 4 feet of the ground. And so a lot of insecticide is wasted covering the canopy of the trees where the beetles don't attack, and spraying in between trees and in between rows where obviously the beetles don't attack because there's no trees there. All this extra insecticide, particularly in the canopy, can kill natural enemies and cause secondary pest outbreaks. So we tried to address these problems, and one way that we approached this was to test a dual nozzle wand where growers could apply permethrin by hand to tree trunks rather than with an airblast sprayer. And this was originally developed and shown to me by a grower at Curran's nursery, Richard Curran, who uses this device to spray trees around a pond where you can't aim an airblast sprayer towards the water. And so we conducted research over a couple of years in plots of red maple trees. And in each plot, we sprayed permethrin either with our dual nozzle wand or with an airblast sprayer. And you can see the difference in the tiny puff of permethrin that's aimed directly at the trunk in the upper picture compared to the giant puff of permethrin in the bottom picture. And what we found is that the amount of permethrin per tree was, as you would expect, vastly greater using the airblast sprayer. And so we used 3 or 4 times as much permethrin product to spray trees with the airblast sprayer. Now, permethrin's not very expensive, but it still is a lot of extra insecticide released into the environment. The tree coverage by the dual nozzle and airblast sprayers was also quite different. So we recorded this with water sensitive cards, and on the base and the trunk of the tree where most beetles attack, the airblast sprayer gave us 65 to 85% coverage. Further up the trunk of the tree, again, 70 to 85% coverage, and 40 to 50% coverage in the middle of the tree canopy, where we don't need permethrin at all for this pest. Using our directed hand nozzle, we got higher coverage of the trunk where we actually need the permethrin to land, and we got very close to no permethrin in the canopy where we don't need it. And so that's where a lot of the savings were in terms of the product that was applied. And the result of this is that we had more natural enemies in the canopy of trees in the manually applied plots compared to the airblast plots. And these are things like minute pirate bugs and lady beetles and green lacewings and things like that. And as a result of having more natural enemies, we had about half as many maple spider mites later in the season in the manual plots, twice as many maple spider mites in the airblast plots because of the detrimental effects of that airblast sprayer on natural enemies in the canopy. And you can see the damage that these maple spider mites cause on maples. And of course, there's lots of other spider mites, 2-spotted spider mites and others that could do similar things to other species of trees. So with the manual applicator, we use less insecticide, we preserve more natural enemies, and we have fewer spider mites and less spider mite damage. We did a quick calculation of the economic cost of this approach. And the permethrin, again, is not very expensive. And so to treat 1 acre, which typically has around 1,100 trees in a pot-in-pot system, the cost of the permethrin was 10 times greater for the airblast sprayer, but still not very much. The labor, of course, was much greater, about twice as much in the manual plot, while the mixing and prep and cleanup took less time. The actual application took longer. And so the total was actually higher cost for the manual application compared to the airblast application, about $65 more per acre. Now, the thing to remember though, when we went back later in the season and counted all those spider mites, is that this doesn't capture the complete cost of using that airblast sprayer. Because if you have twice as many mites and twice as much mite damage, those trees may be harder to sell. You may have to sell them at a discount, or you may need to use a miticide to reduce the mite populations and damage. And whereas permethrin is very inexpensive, these miticides cost quite a bit more. And so the average cost of one miticide application is around $300 per acre. And so that more than outweighs the $65 in labor costs. So something to consider, that the consequences of these insecticide applications do not stop once you put the equipment away. There's ongoing consequences. Okay, so the airblast sprayer uses 8 times as much insecticide. The extra insecticide lands on non-target areas inside and outside the plots. I didn't get into the data, but we captured drift from these sprayers quite a distance from the trees that were being sprayed. The trunk coverage is similar, and the manual application may reduce spider mite outbreaks by preserving natural enemies. So here's one way to add some nuance and some benefit to the standard insecticide applications that people use to manage these pests. But the more interesting thing to me, and probably to most people, is rather than trying to prevent attacks by routine insecticide applications, can we prevent the attacks altogether and make the trees less susceptible to attack? And so we set out to determine why ambrosia beetles attack trees in the first place, and how nursery practices could reduce those attacks. So through many experiments in my lab and those of other labs, particularly Chris Ranger at the USDA in Ohio, who collaborated on a lot of this work, we found that too much water induces ambrosia beetle attacks. And the reason for this, and this is an example of one of the experiments that we did, when trees have too much water and their roots are too wet, they undergo anaerobic respiration, which produces ethanol. And that ethanol is released from the tree trunks. And ethanol is the scent that beetles use to find sick trees. And so by overwatering trees, even healthy trees smell sick to ambrosia beetles, and the ambrosia beetles attack them. And so, for example, in this simple experiment, we had flooded trees and unflooded trees. And all of the waterlogged trees, these were dogwoods and magnolias and redbuds, had from 12 to over 100 attacks per tree within a couple days of being flooded. And the trees that weren't flooded had 0 attacks. And this is consistent. We've done experiments like this with hundreds of trees and never had attacks on unflooded trees. And so the next question, of course, most trees in nurseries are not as flooded as what you see in the picture where there's actually standing water. So we wanted to know how wet a tree can be before it releases ethanol and becomes attractive to ambrosia beetles. So how wet is too wet? So we conducted experiments where we watered dogwoods, and we've repeated this with redbuds and other things. And using automated irrigation, we maintained either 10, 30, 50, 70, or 90% soil moisture in these trees. And we measured soil moisture every couple days, and we counted ambrosia beetle attacks twice a week. And so the goal of this was to tell us, at what point, at what level of soil moisture do trees produce ethanol and become attractive to beetles. Okay, here's our tool to measure soil moisture. And it turns out that all of the attacks happened on trees that had 70 or 90% soil moisture. And in other experiments we've had a few attacks in the 50% soil moisture range. And so now we know that 50, 70, and 90% are probably too wet, as those are the only trees that get attacked. So the next question, of course, is what do nurseries look like? How wet are the pots in most nurseries in North Carolina during the time of year when ambrosia beetles are active? And again, we mentioned that it's really only the spring generation of ambrosia beetles that are a huge problem for nurseries. And the reason for this is that in the early spring, the soil is typically wet because the weather is cool, it's rainier, and the trees often don't have leaves and are not transpiring to move that water out of the pot. And so water can accumulate in that sort of setting. In some cases, growers have the irrigation on that early. So we measured soil moisture in 6 nurseries over a couple of years here to see what the soil moisture was in actual nurseries under their regular practices. And here's what we found. On all the trees, starting in February, soil moisture increased drastically to 60, 70, even 90% in some cases during spring, and then gradually declined as the weather warmed up in May. So we were trapping ambrosia beetles at these nurseries also. And the interesting thing here is that if you overlap the time of year in the bottom graph where ambrosia beetles are at their peak abundance, this is also the time of year when the nursery trees are at their peak soil moisture and when they're above that 30 or 50% threshold most of the time. And so you have a perfect coincidence of high soil moisture and the emergence of beetles in spring that they both taper off later in the year. So not all tree species are equally susceptible to flooding. Of course, some tree species, like red maples, can grow in standing water, can tolerate lots of standing water, and other trees, like dogwoods and redbuds, typically occupy, in their natural environment, typically occupy rocky slopes and drier areas. So of all the potential hosts, we wanted to pick a couple and determine if they were equally susceptible to flooding. And so here's an example of this. And then the other question we had was, if you have trees that are very susceptible to ambrosia beetle attacks, can insecticide even save those trees? So we compared attacks on dogwood and styrax, two commonly grown trees. And for each of those species, we had trees that were flooded or not flooded, and trees that were sprayed with permethrin or not sprayed with permethrin. And of course, we counted the attacks per tree. Starting with the dogwoods in this figure, the flooded trees, which released ethanol that we measured, even the sprayed trees had nearly 20 attacks, or 15 to 20 attacks each, even after they were sprayed. And unsprayed trees that were flooded, of course, had many more than that. But once the tree was, the important thing is that once the tree was flooded, the permethrin really was not effective in deterring the beetles when the trees smelled strongly of ethanol. The non-flooded dogwoods had no attacks, and it didn't matter whether they were sprayed or not because they weren't attractive to the beetles. The spray had no benefit. For styrax, they are more susceptible just overall to ambrosia beetle attacks. They're one of the most commonly attacked species that we see in nurseries. And so in this case, the flooded and non-flooded trees were attacked equally. And again, it didn't matter if you sprayed those trees, they still got attacked. They got attacked less than if they were not sprayed. But typically for ambrosia beetles, 1 or 2 attacks is enough to kill a small caliper tree. And so whether it's 1 or 2 or 10 or 20, the consequences are the same. And so really the non-flooded dogwoods were the least susceptible to ambrosia beetle attacks. So spring water management seems to be a critical component and a cultural IPM tactic that can reduce or even prevent ambrosia beetle attacks. Again, we never have attacks on trees that are not flooded for most species. For trees that are flooded, or too wet, not even flooded, but above that 50% threshold, insecticides do not prevent those attacks. And so they can reduce the attacks, but even trees that are sprayed with permethrin will be attacked to some extent if the water management is not correct. And so one actionable item here, of course, is to grow susceptible, to grow plants. Often nurseries have some wet zones and dry zones just based on the topography. And you probably want to grow your least susceptible plants in those areas. So again, no attacks on trees with 30% moisture or less. Growers can increase the drainage in their pot systems. Oftentimes those get clogged with gravel and leaves and things that that keep them too wet. Keep the irrigation off in spring. Since the trees aren't growing actively, they can tolerate very dry soil, and the soil is wet enough just from the weather and the cool temperatures that irrigation is not necessary at that time of year. And drought does not seem to be a big issue, and so it's better to be underwatered than overwatered in terms of ambrosia beetle attacks. So some other work that's been done, again, by Chris Ranger in Ohio and others, is that freezing stress and frost damage can also induce ethanol production and ambrosia beetle attacks. So this happens, we often see in landscapes where late pruning of crepe myrtles, people like to top those crepe myrtles, and the young shoots start to grow, and if we get frost after that, those shoots are damaged and turn black. And those trees are more susceptible to ambrosia beetle attacks. And so just consider when your pruning occurs and how your trees are protected from frost, because that frost damage can make them more susceptible. So that's the general scenario for ambrosia beetle management. And if you want more information from my extension program, you can follow us on Twitter. The handle is @ornapests for ornamental pests. And all that we use this Twitter feed for is to report pest activity. You know, when we find ambrosia beetles in traps, or when we find insects laying eggs or at a susceptible stage, we can post that on Twitter so growers and landscapers can scout their own plants based on what we're finding. And we also send exotic pest updates on there. Okay, so there's an example of ambrosia beetle research and extension resources that we've tweeted. You can visit my lab website at EcoIPM for more information on the work that we do. And if you want to read the research behind the information that I've given you and those publications, they're posted. Other extension resources are also posted there on lots of different pests, including some free books that the Southern Region IPM Working Group put together. These are free as iBooks or PDFs. Also from the Southern Nursery IPM Working Group, this Southeast Pest Control Guide includes insect pests, diseases, and weed management information and chemical recommendations. And that's all free. And of course, lots of people and lots of nurseries have helped and allowed us to conduct research on their property. So thanks for attending. I appreciate your tuning in, and feel free to shoot me an email if you have questions about the work that we're doing.